The proof that saved my life fit inside one envelope. I was 16, and no one believed me, not even my own mother. What happened next is the reason I'm alive to tell you this story today. The proof that saved my life fit inside one envelope. I was 16, and no one believed me, not even my mother. What you are about to hear is a true story, one I carried in silence for decades. But before we step back into those shadows, let me invite you to sit here with me on the porch for a while. The morning is cool. The steam from my coffee curls up into the air, and the smell of fresh bread drifts from the kitchen window. I've kept this ritual for more than 40 years. Coffee at dawn, bread cooling on the rack, a little moment of peace before the world begins to stir. The mug I'm holding has a chip on the rim. My late husband, Walter, gave it to me one Christmas when times were lean but love was rich. God rest his soul. Every morning I hold it in my hands. I feel his warmth again. That's the sort of thing grief teaches you. That memory can sit with you at the table if you make room for it. Neighbors knock on my door early, sometimes before sunrise, hoping to carry home a few potato rolls or cinnamon buns still warm from the oven. I always slip an extra one into the bag, because people come back not just for food, but for the love you bake into it. My little porch table, the one you'd see if you walked up my steps right now, was made by my grandson Wyatt. He's got hands like his grandfather, steady and kind. He carved our initials on the underside so I'd never forget whose love shaped the wood. This yard is my pride. Apple, cherry, and plum trees cast shade in the summer and blaze in color come autumn. Chickens cluck in the back, providing fresh eggs for breakfast. The garden rows run neat and green, lettuce, kale, parsley, tomatoes. There's something holy about pulling food from the earth with your own hands, and you, my dears, watching me now. I want to know you. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from. Are you sipping coffee with me in the morning? Resting after lunch, or lying down at night with your phone propped on your pillow? I read every word. It makes me feel like my porch stretches across the world, filled with friends who stop by for a story and stay for the company. I'll tell you plainly, this video carries a hard truth. It will stir feelings, maybe shake beliefs, but there are stories, no matter how painful, that must be told, because silence only protects those who hurt us. If I can lay mine bare, perhaps someone out there will find the strength to share theirs too. People sometimes ask, how can you speak of revenge when you spend your days baking, gardening, and greeting neighbors with a smile? But revenge doesn't always come with fire and fury. Sometimes it looks like survival. Sometimes it looks like raising children who grow strong in the places where you once felt broken. Sometimes it looks like sitting here at dawn, free, alive, with the truth finally in the light. I call it my silent revenge. And it began long before this porch, long before the chickens and cherry trees, long before I was the grandmother you see today. It began when I was a girl in a small town, still clinging to childish dreams, still believing that family meant safety. That was before the cinnamon buns everyone loved so much. Before this chipped coffee mug became my morning companion. Before I learned that the very people meant to protect you can become the reason you need protecting at all. Before all of this, there was a storeroom, and a secret that almost ended me. I was born in a small town where doors were left unlocked, and neighbors waved from their porches as if we were all part of one large family. My earliest memories are filled with the rhythm of simple days. The smell of bread rising in my mother's kitchen, the ringing of the blacksmith's hammer as my father shaped iron at dawn, and the laughter of my 3 younger siblings tumbling through the yard. We didn't have much money, but we had fruit trees that bent heavy in summer, and a chicken coop that kept us fed year-round. At night, my father's voice would carry into our room as he told us stories about legends and constellations. He was a man of strong hands but a soft heart, and to us, he seemed unbreakable. But life has a way of shattering the strongest foundations. I was 11 when the first crack appeared. My father had been hiding sharp pains in his chest, insisting it was nothing. One spring morning, while hammering a glowing horseshoe, he collapsed on the floor of his workshop. My brother Theo found him and ran for help, but it was too late. The entire town seemed to gather for the funeral. I still remember standing by the wooden casket, the lump in my throat as I held my siblings' hands, knowing childhood had ended for me that day. My mother, Clara, carried us as best she could. By day she taught school, by night she baked breads and sweets to sell. Sometimes I'd hear her crying quietly behind her bedroom door, though by morning she'd wear a brave smile, never wanting us to see the cracks. I became more than a sister. I became a second mother to Theo, Matilda, and little Abram. Despite our loss, there was comfort in the closeness of the town. Sundays were sacred, church in the morning, laughter and barbecues in the afternoon. The men grilled meat, the women brought potato salad, and the children played tag across the grass. People looked out for one another. In those days, I believed community meant protection, that the world was still safe even if our home had changed. And then he arrived, Leonard Vargas, a man who seemed larger than life in our little town. He was a widower, or so he said, with graying hair neatly trimmed and a smile polished like silver. He owned a general store in a nearby city and carried himself with the confidence of a man used to being listened to. He began to appear often at church, offering donations, shaking hands, speaking kindly to elders. To us children, he brought small gifts, candy, storybooks, little trinkets that lit our eyes with delight. But it was my mother he noticed most. Still young, still beautiful despite her sorrow, she caught his attention quickly. He offered comfort, flowers, promises of stability, and after months of struggling, the idea of someone strong enough to shoulder the burden must have felt like a lifeline to her. I cannot blame her for wanting a way forward. At first, even I thought him kind. My mother's smile returned in his presence, lighter than it had been in years. The town whispered that she was lucky, that we all were, to have caught the eye of such a generous man. He promised opportunity, education, and security, all the things my mother longed to give us. But even then, something in his eyes unsettled me. They lingered too long when they fell on me, a girl just learning what it meant to grow up. I didn't yet understand the danger, but a quiet voice inside me whispered caution. I have learned since that kindness, when worn like a mask, is hard to rip off. But the eyes always betray. When my mother married Leonard, our world changed overnight. We left behind the small wooden house with its fruit trees and creaking porch and moved into his brick home in the city. To my younger siblings, it felt like a palace. To me, it felt like a cage. The house had 2 floors, tall windows, and heavy curtains that blocked the sun. The hallways were quiet, as if sound itself had been ordered to obey. From the moment we arrived, Leonard laid down rules, not suggestions, not guidance, but commands. There was a time for meals, a time for studying, a time for sleep. Voices were to be hushed when he was home. Friends were not welcome unless he approved them first. Even laughter felt out of place under his roof. My mother, once independent and lively, seemed to shrink in his presence. She was anxious to please him, quick to change her tone if he so much as raised an eyebrow. I began to notice how she looked at the clock, as if her whole life now ticked to his schedule. At first, I thought he was simply strict. But rules, when they steal your freedom one by one, are not meant to guide. They are meant to control. He took an interest in me early. Too much of an interest. On my 13th birthday, he handed me a dress. Not a child's dress, but something fitted, grown, far too mature for my age. He gave it to me in front of the family, smiling in a way that made my skin crawl. "Wear it to church on Sunday," he said, as if it were an order, not a gift. I tried to resist. I told him it was too tight, that I was uncomfortable. His face changed in an instant. He didn't raise his voice, but his words came through clenched teeth, quiet and sharp. "You will wear it. And if you don't, there will be consequences, not just for you." So I wore the dress. At church, I felt the stares, heard the whispers. A kind neighbor leaned in and said softly, "That dress isn't right for a girl your age." But Leonard's hand clamped down on my shoulder, firm and heavy, and he answered for me with a smile that never reached his eyes. "She's becoming a young lady," he said. The pressure of his fingers told me the real message. Silence. That night, I dragged a wooden chair against the door of the bedroom I shared with my sister Matilda. It was a child's attempt at protection, a desperate wall made of pine and prayer. To anyone else, it was just furniture. To me, it was a scream no one else could hear. My mother noticed the chair the next morning. "Why is that there?" she asked. I tried to explain, but she cut me off. "Don't be ungrateful. Leonard has given us a good home. He only wants what's best." I wanted to shout that safety doesn't come from walls of brick, that kindness can't be measured in gifts or food on the table. But the words stuck in my throat. I swallowed them, just as I swallowed my fear, because I understood something clearly. I was alone in this. Still, even at that age, I began to fight in small ways. I lingered at school to avoid being home alone with him. I clung to the company of my siblings, making sure we were rarely separated. I learned to watch his eyes instead of his smile, because the eyes tell the truth. Rules and routines can look harmless from the outside. But inside those walls, each one was a lock on a door I could no longer open. And that's when I learned a lesson I will never forget. You can be a prisoner with the door wide open. In houses like the one we lived in, silence does a lot of work. It fills the hallways. It smooths over questions. It teaches you to measure your steps so the floorboards don't complain. On the outside, our family looked like a neat picture in a shop window. On the inside, I learned to hold my breath. School became my only room with oxygen. Mrs. Thompson, thin, watchful, the sort of teacher who learns the names of your younger siblings before they're even in her class, saw I'd changed. I'd always loved reading. Lately, the letters swam and wouldn't stay still. One afternoon, she asked me to stay after the bell. She didn't push a chair toward me. She took one beside me, so our knees almost touched and neither of us had to look up or down. "Is everything all right at home?" she asked. The question came soft, like a bird landing. I wanted to say yes because yes keeps things simple, and simple felt safer. But my throat knew different. Tears came first. Words came broken, then stopped. I told her I was tired, that I couldn't keep up since my father died. Both were true. Neither was the truth. She reached for a tissue and placed it in my hand without touching me, like passing a note in class. "If you ever need to talk," she said, "I'm here. No judgments. No rush." Then she said the detail that has stayed with me longer than any lesson. The first thing a person needs is to be believed. She looked at me in a way that made belief feel possible. But belief is expensive when the town admires the man you fear. I left her classroom and walked home very slowly, counting the slabs in the sidewalk and wishing the street would grow longer. At the pharmacy, Mrs. Baker watched me the way a mother watches her child cross a busy road. She had kind eyes and the sort of voice that makes your shoulders drop. She noticed small things. How I flinched when the doorbell chimed and Leonard stepped in. How I stood just to the side of his shadow, never under it. One day, while he fetched something from the back, she leaned across the counter and asked, "Are you sleeping, dear?" "I am," I said, which was true between 2 and 4 in the morning sometimes. "If you ever need a cup of tea in a quiet room," she said, "you come to me." Then Leonard returned, cheerful and obliging, with the small talk he wore like a pressed shirt. He paid for the aspirin, patted my shoulder, and told Mrs. Baker how proud he was of his responsible girl. On the walk home, I felt the place where his hand had rested, as if someone had pressed a coin into warm wax. For all the eyes in a small town, very few see. The ones that do often look away, because seeing demands action, and action risks comfort. My mother's eyes were the hardest to understand. She had been brave once. After my father died, she carried the world in 2 hands and still found a way to smile at us over dinner. With Leonard, I watched her bravery fold itself into small, tidy shapes that fit inside his rules. When I tried to speak, she would say, "He's strict, yes, but he keeps us fed." Dependence can sound like gratitude if you say it softly enough. There were moments when the shell around her seemed to crack. She might catch the edge in his voice, or the way his gaze stayed too long, and a flash of doubt would pass through her like lightning behind a cloud. But then bills arrived, or the pantry needed stocking, or someone from church praised Leonard's donation to the new roof, and the sky in her eyes went clear again. The church did what churches do when a smiling man gives generously. It shook his hand. At Sunday service, he carried hymnals for elderly ladies and nodded along to the sermon about righteousness, like a man checking off items on a list. People thanked him for sponsoring the youth picnic. They thanked him loudly enough that anyone standing beside him felt the gratitude too. If you've never stood in a room where everyone trusts the person you fear, you might not understand how loud thank yous can sound. I learned my roots. I learned which aisles to avoid in the store so we wouldn't be alone. I learned to keep my sister close, like a string tied round my wrist. I learned that some adults will drift near you like boats, and never dock because docking is noisy and might attract attention. But not everyone drifted. Theo started to watch the way I watched. Matilda began to ask questions she pretended were about homework. And those small watches and questions stitched themselves into something strong enough to hold. I wish I could tell you I found the courage to speak, and the town rallied, and everything changed. It didn't. Courage needs a place to land. Truth needs a witness. I had neither, not yet. So I made a new kind of plan, one that didn't require anyone to hear my voice. If hearts can be persuaded to ignore you, paper cannot. If no one will step between you and danger, perhaps numbers will. If no one would believe my voice, maybe evidence would speak louder. Sometimes the smallest cracks let in the first light. For me, that light came not from the adults who promised protection, but from the younger voices who shared my room and my fears. My siblings saw what others ignored, and in their quiet way, they decided they would not let me carry it alone. Theo was 14 then, already tall for his age, with hands that wanted to build but fists that clenched when Leonard walked by. He was too young to challenge a grown man, but old enough to understand the danger. One night, after a storm rattled the windows, he whispered to me in the dark, "If he hurts you again, I'll stop him." I wanted to believe him, but I also knew the weight difference between a boy's body and a man's rage. Still, that sentence, "I'll stop him," planted something in me. Hope. Fragile, but real. Matilda, only 12, had sharper eyes than all of us. She noticed when I folded my skirts to hide a swelling belly, before even I admitted what was happening. She was the first person I couldn't lie to. "It was him, wasn't it?" she whispered one night. I didn't answer, but silence can be a confession. She squeezed my hand and said, "We'll figure something out." And that was the moment when my siblings became my shield. We began to whisper plans in corners, behind closed doors, in the hush of night when the house slept. We didn't speak loudly enough to wake suspicion, but loud enough to stitch together courage. The plan was simple and yet impossibly daring. Find proof. Not stories, not tears. Proof. Matilda remembered Mrs. Baker's daughter, Beatrice, who had studied nursing in Flint. "She could help us," she said. "Maybe she knows someone who can run tests." The word tests felt like a lifeline. At school, we learned that blood and hair carried information. What if those tiny details could finally say what no one wanted to hear from me? Theo nodded. "If we get something of his hair, or a toothbrush, maybe they can prove it." The idea seemed reckless, terrifying even, but the thought of having undeniable evidence filled me with a strength I hadn't felt in months. The next afternoon, Theo returned from the bathroom carrying a small handkerchief folded tight. Inside were strands of hair pulled from Leonard's brush. His face was pale but proud. "I wrapped it without touching," he said, like a scientist describing his experiment. He had risked being caught, but he grinned as if he'd stolen fire from the gods. A day later, he added a cigarette butt. "He chews the tobacco and rolls his own," Theo explained. "I saw him toss this into the yard. I picked it up before the wind could take it." He tucked it into the same folded cloth. To anyone else, it was trash. To us, it was proof waiting to speak. Matilda, braver than her years, offered to reach Beatrice. At the pharmacy, she found a way to whisper the truth without spelling it all out. Mrs. Baker listened, her lips pressed tight, and nodded. That night, Matilda told me Beatrice was willing to help. She could send samples to a lab in Detroit, where the results would carry more weight than any denial. When she told me, my hands shook. I pulled strands from my own hair, placing them in the envelope beside Leonard's. It felt almost ceremonial, as though I was placing my future into that small paper tomb. My hands trembled, but my heart steadied. At last, the truth had something solid to stand on. For weeks we carried on like spies under our own roof. Theo guarded the envelope as if it were a holy relic. Matilda rehearsed excuses in case anyone asked where she was headed. I stayed quiet, trying not to draw attention while my belly grew heavier with every day. All the while the envelope waited, an ordinary scrap of paper hiding extraordinary weight. We had the samples. Now we needed a lab and time. Waiting can be louder than any storm. It rattles the dishes in the cupboard and makes the clock tick like a hammer. After we sealed those strands of hair and the cigarette butt inside an ordinary envelope, time stopped behaving. Minutes stretched thin, nights doubled in length, mornings arrived with their shoelaces untied. Matilda said Beatrice would carry the samples quietly to a friend in Detroit. "A proper lab," she whispered, as if the word proper could protect us. Theo rehearsed the delivery 10 different ways, mapping out what to say if anyone asked where he'd been, what he carried, why he looked so serious. He practiced calm. I practiced breathing. My room became a waiting room. The curtains stayed half-drawn. Sunlight wandered across the floorboards like a cat that didn't trust us yet. I counted the days by the tea stains on my saucer and the soft ache in my back. At night, when the house settled and the pipes sighed, I counted the baby's kicks. Small taps at first, like a polite knock, then stronger rhythms that made my breath catch. Every flutter felt like a promise. I'm here. Keep going. I spoke to the child under my breath. I told stories about the river where we'd someday throw crumbs to ducks, about apple trees in summer shade, about a porch I hadn't met yet but could already feel beneath my palms. I promised safety out loud, because promises sometimes need to hear themselves to become real. Fear, however, loves routine. It slipped into the room each night the way the hallway light slipped under the door, thin, persistent. What if Beatrice couldn't send the samples? What if the lab lost them? What if the results came back cloudy or never came at all? Worst of all, what if the truth arrived and no one listened? Proof is a powerful thing, but people can be louder. Theo kept guard in the small ways that matter most. He learned the creak in the third stair and how to step over it. He timed the walk from the bus stop to our gate so that he could slip inside a minute before Leonard's boots touched the porch. Matilda stood at the window with a book open, turning pages without reading, scanning the street for a familiar figure from the pharmacy. We all performed our parts. Ordinary children doing ordinary chores, hiding a revolution inside our sleeves. Some days, courage felt like a solid rock in my pocket. Other days it felt like sand. I wore loose blouses and tied sweaters around my waist, telling myself there was still time before questions gathered like birds on a wire. My mother came in with plates I couldn't finish. and eyes I couldn't read. She asked if I needed more pillows. She asked if I needed rest. She did not ask what I needed most. Need can be a frightening word when you fear the answer. The house held its breath. Even the radio seemed quieter, as if songs were a luxury we could not afford. In the storeroom beyond the kitchen, I avoided looking at the latch. I poured my attention into small tasks, mending a seam, straightening a stack of school papers left behind, wiping a shelf that didn't require wiping. Busy hands can sometimes convince a trembling heart. On the fourth Sunday, the church bells rang, and I stayed home. Matilda pressed her forehead to mine before she left and whispered, "Soon." She meant results, release, running, returning, all of it at once. Theo squeezed my shoulder the way our father once did when he didn't have words, then followed her out. I listened to their footsteps fade, then to my own heartbeat, then to the baby's steady tap against my ribs. I'm here. Keep going. In the afternoons, I stood at the window and watched the street without appearing to watch. The pharmacy's striped awning was 3 blocks away if you cut across the alley and past Mrs. Penn's rhododendrons. I traced that path with my eyes until I could walk it with my eyes closed. Sometimes a figure turned the corner and my breath caught, only to release when it was just a neighbor boy on a bicycle or the postman with his canvas bag. Hope teaches you the shapes of strangers. Fear teaches you their shadows. At night, I dreamed of envelopes. Thin ones that fluttered from my hands, heavy ones that sank through the floor. Some were blank. Some had writing I couldn't read no matter how close I held them to the light. I woke with my palm curved as if I were still holding paper. Then I'd feel the small heel press against my skin and remember the only message that mattered. I'm here. Keep going. The day it happened was a Wednesday that smelled like rain. Clouds stitched themselves low across the sky, and the world looked closer than usual. I heard the gate click, then Matilda's careful footsteps. Then the soft, urgent knock we had agreed upon. 3 quick, 2 slow. I opened the door, and she slid inside like a note under a desk. Her fingers trembled around the edge of a plain envelope, the kind you'd overlook on any other day. "Beatrice got it," she whispered. Theo stepped in behind her, closing the door with his shoulder. He looked older than he had the week before. My knees went weak, and I sat on the edge of the bed. The room fell quiet, except for the rain beginning on the window and the smallest rhythm inside me. Theo placed the envelope in my hands as if it were a newborn. We didn't open it. Not yet. We had learned that truth comes with echoes. Once released, it would call other sounds. Arguments, denials, decisions that couldn't be unmade. For a long breath, we just let it rest there, cooling the heat of our hands. One envelope could free us, or destroy us. We waited until the rain settled into a steady whisper. Thunder had moved on. The house sounded hollow, like it knew something was about to change. Theo sat on the chair by the door, elbows on his knees, eyes on the envelope. Matilda stood close enough to touch my shoulder without crowding me. I held the paper like you hold a bird you mean to free, carefully, but with purpose. I slid a butter knife under the flap so we wouldn't tear anything we might need later. The seal gave with a soft sigh. Inside were 2 sheets, one with numbers and letters stacked like a narrow city, the other with a paragraph in plain language. I didn't try the city first. I chose the paragraph, the way a person chooses a road with signs instead of landmarks. The heading said Detroit. A date, a name I did not recognize under a title that sounded official enough to stand in a room and be believed. I read the summary once with my eyes, then I read it again with my voice, because some truths need to be heard out loud to become real. Based on the blood group factors tested, I read, careful to keep my voice even. Paternity by the alleged male cannot be excluded. Findings are consistent with paternity. My hands shook. The page fluttered. I set it on my lap and read the same line again, slower, so it could land and stay. Paternity cannot be excluded. The words were simple as a wooden bench. They did not beg to be believed. They simply were. The paragraph added details about shared subtypes, about statistical likelihoods in a regional population. Words I would later learn to recite from memory. But the sentence that mattered most was short enough to fit inside a heartbeat. Paternity cannot be excluded. Theo exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since the day we sealed the first strand of hair. Matilda pressed her hand against my back, steady and warm. We were quiet for a long moment, letting the room reshape itself around the new fact. I lifted the second sheet. Columns and markers, letters I remembered from school, A, B, O, and smaller notations my teacher had never mentioned. My finger traced each match as if I were connecting stars. I didn't need to understand the math to understand the meaning. The numbers did not lie. They could be ignored, argued with, shouted over, but they did not lie. "Will they listen to this?" Matilda asked, her voice small and fierce at the same time. "They'll have to," Theo said, but he said it like a man testing the strength of a rope he still doesn't fully trust. I folded the summary and slipped it back into the envelope, leaving the flap open so it wouldn't look newly sealed. We had learned to think like careful people. What questions will be asked? What will we show first? Who speaks when? Where do we stand in the room? Courage is a feeling, yes, but it is also a plan. "We show Mom," I said. The words felt heavy and right. "We show her first," Theo nodded. "Tonight, while he's home, so he can hear it at the same time." Matilda's hand tightened on my shoulder. "Are you sure?" "No," I said honestly. "But truth has to stand where lies have been living." We began to rehearse. Not the sentences, but the order of them. I would read the plain language summary. Theo would hold the second page in case he tried to snatch the first. Matilda would stay near our mother, not to sway her but to steady her if the ground moved under her feet. We decided where to sit, how to keep a table between him and me without making it look like a barricade. We even chose the room, the living room, where the radio sat, where family news was usually shared. The ordinary place for an extraordinary moment. Twice before sunset, I almost lost my nerve. I thought of the ways people deny what they cannot bear. I remembered every time my mother looked away because looking was costly. Proof is beautiful on paper. It is heavy in the mouth. But then the baby moved, one sure press, then another. And I remembered the line that had just entered our lives and would not leave. Paternity cannot be excluded. The house grew quiet, the way a stage grows quiet when the curtain lifts. From the kitchen came the sounds of plates and running water. From the porch, a small draft slid under the front door. I tucked the envelope inside a book and held the book like any girl might hold a thing she's been reading all afternoon. We waited for the sound of his boots on the steps. The clock marked each minute like a metronome for my heart. Theo stood and opened the living room curtains a little wider so evening could see us. Matilda took a seat near my mother's chair, as natural as if she'd always sat there. When the door opened, the night came in with him. Wet wool, tobacco, the scrape of keys. He set his hat on the hook as if this were any other day. Perhaps for him, it was. I looked at the book in my lap, at the envelope inside, at my siblings' faces steady as fence posts in a hard wind. I thought of my teacher saying, "The first thing a person needs is to be believed." I thought of Mrs. Baker's careful eyes. I thought of all the people who had not seen and the few who had tried. Truth needs a witness. Tonight we would find out if our mother could be one. Evening folded itself over the house like a heavy blanket. Lamps clicked on one by one. The radio hummed low. In that gentle domestic sound, we took our places as if for a family photograph that would never be framed. My mother dried her hands on a towel and came to sit in her chair beside the radio. Theo stood at the edge of the rug with his shoulder close to mine. Matilda perched on the arm of our mother's chair, not clinging, just near enough to be a shoreline if the room turned into water. I held the book with the envelope tucked inside, the way I had practiced. Ordinary girl, ordinary page. He came in last, hat on the hook, keys in the dish, a practiced sigh as if work were a weight only he knew how to lift. Evening? He said to no one and everyone, and the air seemed to brace. We need to talk, I said. Not loud, not shaking, just true. He looked at me, then at my mother. About what? About a mistake, I said, and a proof. I opened the book and slid the envelope free. I could feel Theo's breath steadying beside me. He smiled, the polite kind he used with church deacons and store suppliers. You've been reading, Eleanor. That's good. Education is important for girls. I didn't answer the bait. I unfolded the Detroit letter and set the numbers page on the table where Theo's hand could reach it if needed. Then I read the paragraph. The same sentence that had already changed the shape of the day. Based on the blood group factors tested, paternity by the alleged male cannot be excluded. Findings are consistent with paternity. No one moved. Even the radio seemed to hold its next note. My mother frowned in the way people do when they're trying to hear something far away. Her eyes searched my face, then the paper, as if truth might be hiding between lines. The smile fell off his face like a coin knocked from a table. He laughed once, dry, almost friendly. This is nonsense, he said, reaching for the page. Theo stepped just enough. The paper stayed with me. It's from a proper lab, I said. The summary is plain. The markers match. Anyone can type a letterhead, he replied, voice smooth again. You're a troubled girl telling stories to cover her shame. Matilda's voice cut the air like a thin bell. Then why are your hands shaking? They were, the smallest tremor, running from wrist to fingertip. He hid them in his pockets and took a breath through his nose. My mother picked up the edge of the summary. Her eyes moved slowly, catching on the bolded line. Cannot be excluded, she read out loud, as if the words might behave better if spoken in her voice. He turned to her, quick and gentle the way a man turns to a skittish horse. Clara, think. She's lied before. She has filled their heads with madness. She's trying to ruin us. She hasn't spoken, I said. The paper is speaking. His jaw worked. He took a step toward me. Theo's shoulder touched mine, firm as a wall. Enough, he said, and there it was, the tear in the mask. Just a thread, but once you see it, you can't unsee. The voice that had charmed church ladies had a burr in it now. The eyes that smiled for the town went flat and cold. My mother's gaze flicked from him to me and back. Memory rose behind her face like weather. The bruise she explained away, the dress too grown, the way laughter had learned to hush in this house. I watched doubt become recognition, and recognition harden into something older and stronger. A mother's fury that had forgotten itself and now remembered. Is it true? She asked him. Not a shout, a summons. He smiled again, but the edges didn't match the middle. You're nothing without me, he said. And the room heard what it always had, only now without music behind it. He lunged. It was small, a reach for the paper, a sweep of the arm, but it was a lunge all the same. Theo moved first, hips lowered like a boy who'd learned to brace a door. Their shoulders hit, not hard, but enough to stop the reach. My mother stood. In one motion she lifted the small radio from the table and struck the side of his arm, not to break, but to halt. The radio clattered to the rug and rolled, a tin rattle on wool. He staggered a half step, surprised that anyone in this room could alter his path. Don't touch my daughter, she said, each word clear as glass. The spell broke, not with shouting, but with arrangement. People moved into their true places. Matilda's hand found my mother's. Theo widened his stance. I kept the paper against my chest, the baby's steady pressure answering from the inside. I'm here. Keep going. He looked at us, the four of us in a line he had never meant to face, and did the thing men do when control slips. He threatened. "Walk out that door," he said, breathing hard, "and you'll have nothing." "Then we'll have nothing," my mother answered. "But you will not have us." Silence followed, full and bright, like a bell right after it struck. Through the window the streetlights had come on. Somewhere far away a dog barked. Inside, the only sound was our breathing, and the small click of the cooling radio. I folded the letter, slid it back into the envelope, and put it into my pocket. I lifted my coat from the chair. My mother took her purse from the hook. Matilda tied the scarf under her chin. Theo picked up 2 small bundles he had packed earlier in a hope so quiet I hadn't heard it rustling. We didn't slam any doors. We didn't shout. We walked toward the porch like people leaving a movie they didn't care to finish. He stood where he was, as if the room were a boat that had suddenly run aground. At the threshold, my mother turned once, not for him, but for the home she'd tried to make from a cage. "Children," she said, "stay close. Freedom is a door you sometimes have to run through in the dark." We stepped into the night with the kind of quiet that makes people turn and look without knowing why. The streetlights poured their thin circles on the sidewalk, and our breaths made small ghosts in the cold. I didn't look back. Not for him. Not for that house. I held the envelope in my pocket like a compass I could feel, and we walked. At the corner, Theo shifted the 2 small bundles he had packed, a change of clothes, a family photograph, and the little money my mother had hidden beneath a loose floorboard years ago and then forgotten, or tried to. Matilda walked beside me so close our coats brushed with every step. My mother kept pace half a stride ahead, as if breaking a path through snow we could not see. The bus station glowed like a lighthouse at the end of the block. Faded posters, a humming vending machine, a clerk who had long since stopped being surprised by midnight stories. We bought 4 tickets with bills my mother flattened against the counter. The clerk didn't raise an eyebrow at the hour or the way my hand stayed pressed to my coat pocket. He stamped the tickets, slid them through the window, and said the kindest sentence a stranger can say. "Gate 3 boards in 5. We sat on a hard bench and studied the floor tiles like they were a map. All around us were other departures. A man with a suitcase tied by twine, a girl tracing loops on a fogged window with her finger, a grandmother asleep with her chin tucked into her scarf. The heater rattled. Somewhere a cup hit a trash can and missed. Matilda leaned her head on my shoulder. "When we get there," she whispered, "Beatrice said we can stay with her until we think of something else." Theo nodded, jaw set in a way that made him look older than he was. My mother's hands rested on her knees, open, as if she were offering them to whatever future would take them. When the bus pulled in, its brakes sighed like a tired animal. We filed on with the small, stunned grace of people who have done something impossible and are waiting to see if the world will correct them. The driver took our tickets without looking too long at our faces. We chose seats together near the back. The lights dimmed. Road noise is a blanket that tucks you in whether you want it to or not. Houses slid by like pages turned in a book you don't plan to reread. I pressed my palm to my belly and felt the steady drum of small feet from within. "I'm here. Keep going." Outside, rain stitched the windows. Inside, the envelope warmed to the heat of my leg. For the first miles, no one spoke. Then, as if the bus itself demanded tribute, we paid our silence with small sentences. Theo said, "I packed the photograph of the apple tree." Matilda said, "Beatrice's mother keeps chamomile tea in a blue tin." My mother said, very quietly, "Forgive me." She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. The words traveled across the aisle and sat down in my lap like a child needing to be held. I covered her hand with mine. "We're here," I said. It was both answer and promise. We arrived in the gray of early morning. The station in the new city smelled like wet newspapers and coffee. Beatrice was waiting by the newspaper stand, hair tucked into a scarf, eyes bright with worry and relief. She hugged my mother first, then Matilda, then me carefully, as if I were carrying something breakable, which I was. "You're safe now," she said. And when she spoke, the muscles in my back unclenched for the first time in months. Her apartment was small, but to us it felt like a cathedral. 2 couches, a wobbly lamp, a blanket that didn't match anything else. Holy things, all of them. She made tea. My mother cried into the steam. Theo carried our bundles to a corner and stood with his hands in his pockets, not knowing whether to sit, and then sat anyway. Matilda found a deck of cards and dealt them face down like a magician who has just remembered her trick. I lay on the couch, and the couch held me. Not the way a bed holds you because you belong to the house, but the way a boat holds you because you belong to the river now. The ceiling had a crack that made the shape of a branch. I traced it with my eyes until it became a tree, and then a road, and then nothing at all because I had fallen asleep. When I woke, the room was full of the kind of morning that forgives. Beatrice was stirring a pot on the stove. Oatmeal. The modest kind that tastes like kindness when you've been hungry for other things. She handed me a bowl and said, "Eat until you feel your feet under you." I took a spoonful and felt the simple warmth travel down and settle someplace that had been cold too long. It tasted like freedom, plain, steady, and enough. Theo told a joke that wasn't funny, and we laughed anyway. Then he told another, and it was a little funny, and we laughed for real. Matilda laughed so hard she had to set down her bowl. The sound startled me, and then soothed me, like a bird returning to a tree you thought the storm had taken. After breakfast, Beatrice found a spare dress for me and a soft sweater that smelled faintly of soap and peppermint. My mother stood at the window and watched the street below as if she were waiting to see us arrive. She turned and said, "We'll need to find work. We'll need to find a place." She said it with the old iron in her voice, the kind she used to have when my father was alive, when problems were puzzles you could solve with hands and time. I reached into my pocket and took out the envelope. We didn't open it. We didn't need to. It had already done its work. I set it on the table beside the bowls and the spoon handles and the day-old newspaper, as if it were just another ordinary thing living in an ordinary morning. We had left with almost nothing, yet sitting there, warm bowl in hand, laughter still hanging in the air, I felt rich in a way I had not felt in years. Not because of money, because the future had turned from a wall into a hallway with doors. That day, safety was a couch and a bowl of oatmeal. It was Beatrice humming in the kitchen and my mother planning out loud. It was Theo mending the wobbly lamp with a coin under its leg. It was Matilda's head tipping onto my shoulder again, but this time from sleep, not fear. Survival is revenge, but I wanted something better, a life. Starting over isn't a single act. It's 100 small ones done in the same direction. We learned that in Beatrice's apartment, where the lamp wobbled until Theo shimmed it with a coin and then didn't wobble anymore. That's how our life began. One small fix at a time. My mother took a cleaning job at the hospital where Beatrice worked. She came home with sore hands and a softer face, the way a person looks when effort finally moves the needle. Theo found a carpenter who needed an extra pair of hands. He swept sawdust, carried boards, and before long, measured twice before cutting once. Matilda enrolled at the new school and joined the first aid club because Beatrice said that knowing how to help is a kind of wealth you can carry anywhere. I signed up for night school. A bus there, a bus back. The teacher wrote fractions on the board, and I copied them with the careful attention you give to things you once thought you would never hold again. I learned to take notes in small, tidy lines. I learned how to study with my back against a radiator, and how to breathe through a cramp until it passed. After class, I'd walk past the bakery that left its door open to let the heat out and the smell of sugar in. That sweetness followed me home like a promise. The baby came on a bright day that smelled like rain that never arrived. She was small and sure, with fists like commas, pauses between sentences we hadn't written yet. I named her Hope because she was, and because I wanted to speak her destiny every time I said her name. We made a crib from a drawer lined with a folded blanket and set it on 2 chairs beside my bed. Some nights I watched her breathe as if watching alone could keep her safe. I finished the term with grades that surprised me. Then another. Between classes and diapers and dishwater, I picked up shifts at a diner where the owner believed in second chances and bottomless coffee. I learned people's orders before they opened their mouths. I learned the strength of a kitchen rag well wrung and the music of plates finding their place. That's where I met Walter. He was a bricklayer whose hands spoke the language of straight lines and level soles. He sat at the counter, ordered meatloaf on Thursdays, and left exact change because he liked things that balanced. At first our conversations were practical: weather, bus schedules, the way the river looked after snowmelt. Then he started asking about my classes. Fractions today, I'd say. They're teaching me how to split a hole and still keep track of everything. He smiled like a man who has watched walls rise from stacks of ordinary bricks and knows what persistence can do. One evening, after the dinner rush, I told him more of the truth than I'd told anyone outside our family. He didn't lean in the way some people do when they collect stories. He kept his elbows off the counter and his eyes steady and said, "You didn't deserve any of it." Not a question. A ground rule. Later, when he met Hope, he crouched to her height and offered his finger. She wrapped it in her small hand, as if she'd been waiting for that exact measure of kindness. We married at City Hall with Beatrice as witness, and a grocery bouquet that smelled like a garden that had worked hard. Walter adopted Hope as his daughter. The courthouse clerk stamped papers with a thump that sounded like a door shutting on a long hallway. We walked out into afternoon sun that made the sidewalk look newly washed, and I felt something lift from my chest that I'd been carrying so long I thought it was part of me. We rented a small house near the river. It was nothing like the brick house we left and everything we needed. Walter built us a porch from reclaimed boards and taught Theo how to set a string line so the posts wouldn't drift. On Saturdays, we sanded splinters and sealed the wood together, and by Sunday, coffee tasted better outside. I started baking again. First for us, then for neighbors. Cinnamon and cardamom on cold mornings. Lemon and sugar when the trees budded. People knocked early and left with warm paper bags. They began to stay for a minute on the steps, telling me about their children's colds and the dress on layaway and the way the landlord finally fixed the leak. A porch turned strangers into neighbors faster than any streetlight. Hope grew like a sapling in good soil. Tall, curious, and hard to discourage. She once asked me if love was heavy or light. Both, I said. It's the thing that lets you carry what you thought you couldn't. Years later, my grandson Wyatt carved a small table with his own hands and left it under the porch rafters for me to find. He signed the underside the way a craftsman signs a song, quietly but forever. We set cooling racks on that table, and on hot days the bread steamed and the backyard smelled like forgiveness. Some victories arrive with trumpets. Mine came with receipts, homework, tea towels, and the sound of a child laughing in the next room. I learned that steady work is a form of prayer. That paying rent on time is a hymn. That showing up, again and again, is a kind of vow renewal with your own life. Neighbors began to say things like, "You make this block feel like home." The pastor's wife asked me to bring rolls to the fundraiser. I said yes and made double, because I remember what hunger feels like even when it's not about food. When Hope turned 18 and left for the city to study, we boxed her books and newspaper and let her go with a smile and a quiet cry. Walter squeezed my hand and said, "We built a good place for her to leave from." That's another kind of victory no one claps for, but they should. I won't tell you the past vanished. It didn't. It walked beside me, polite some days, insistent on others. But I learned to carry it the way a potter mends a broken bowl, with gold in the cracks, not to hide them, but to honor what survived. The past never vanished. I learned to carry it, like a scar filled with gold. If you've stayed with me this far, Thank you for sitting on this porch, through the hard parts and the healing. I want to say something plain, so it lands where it needs to. You are not alone. Maybe you're watching with the volume low. Maybe the house is quiet and the fear is loud. I know that kind of night. Hear me. What was done to you is not your fault. Your worth is not up for debate, and there is a way forward, even if you can't see it yet. Start small, but start safe. If you can, tell one trustworthy person, a friend, a teacher, a neighbor, a colleague, someone who listens more than they speak. If you need professional help, look for local resources in your area. Counselors, support groups, legal aid, shelters. Keep notes if it's safe to do so. Evidence can speak when voices are ignored. Your story matters, and so do you. This channel is not a courtroom. It's a porch light. If my story helped you feel less alone, I'd be honored to hear from you. In the comments, write the word strength for yourself, for someone you love, or for anyone reading who needs a hand to hold in the dark. Your one word might be the lifeline a stranger grabs tonight. If you want more true stories told with care, and a community that answers gently, subscribe and keep a seat at this table. We'll keep the light on. We'll keep the water warm for tea. We'll keep telling the truth that set people free. I still wake early. I still bake bread that fills this little street with the smell of home. And every morning, I remember what freedom tastes like. Every dawn I greet, every loaf I bake, is my answer. This is my silent revenge.